So this is the last lecture of the series. So far I've been telling you about networks that are a very specific synaptic connectivity structure. And basically they've all been variants of they either covariance, they either obey the covariance synaptic plasticity rule or variance covariance rule. And these type of rules are also sometimes called the Hebbian rule. And basically, so one, and of course, one example, for instance, is this solid Feigelman connectivity matrix, which I will come back to at some point today. And we've studied the properties of these networks, and in particular the storage capacity and other things. So in 1988, the late Elizabeth Gardner introduced a completely different approach. So the idea was no longer to focus on a particular plasticity rule, but rather to look at the whole space of all possible connectivity matrices. And then in that space, we'll just focus on a subspace, the subspace that satisfies all the constraints that are imposed by learning. So, so the idea is that suppose that I give you a set of, so I have a set of P patterns. So that's again these psi I mu's. And so this the goal of the goal is to have all these patterns as fixed point attractors of the network, though you could imagine other scenarios, and I'll come back at the end of the scenario where the goal is to have this network to store a sequence of these patterns. All patterns should be fixed point attractors of the dynamics. So to achieve this goal, we need to satisfy a number of constraints, and basically these constraints are that so psi mu should be equal to the sine. So I'm back to plus and minus 1 neurons for simplicity. So psi mu should be equal to the sine of sum over j, jij, psi j mu. And I have basically p times n constraints, because these should be satisfied for all neurons I and all patterns mu. Okay. And in fact, we can rewrite these constraints using, so we can define a parameter delta I mu, which is equal to psi I mu sum over j, jij, psi j mu. And we will call it the stability of pattern mu at neuron I. So we have Pn stabilities, and you can see that this constraint is equivalent to delta I mu should be positive for all I and mu. Okay. And so you can see that these constraints are basically hyperplanes in the space of weights. Okay. So the idea is that each of these constraints defines a hyperplane. The hyperplane is defined by delta mu equals 0. And the idea is that you need to be on one side of the hyperplane to learn the corresponding pattern. So if we represent this schematically, in the space of weights. So of course this is a really high dimensional space. But the idea is that we'll have a number of hyperplanes. And let's say you have, this is for mu equal 1. Here I'm focusing on one particular neuron, I. And so we have one pattern will impose a particular constraint. So you should be on this side of the hyperplane, and maybe for another pattern you'll be on that side, and then for a third pattern you'll be on that side. And so that will define a subspace, this subspace. I will call the Gardner subspace or Gardner volume. And this is the subspace of weights that satisfies all the constraints imposed by learning. So this is a really nice approach because here you're not assuming any particular plasticity rule. You're just looking at the whole space of connectivity matrices that achieves this particular goal, which is storing these patterns as fixed point attractors. Note that in fact, so we see that we have p times n constraints here, and in fact each neuron has its own p constraints. You see that each constraint involves only the set of weights of one particular neuron I. So in fact, for each neuron, the problem that it faces is equivalent to the problem that a simple feed-forward network called the perceptron faces. So what is a perceptron? So the perceptron is the simplest feed-forward network where you have n input neurons and one output neuron. And so you can see that in this network we have, for each pattern, we have each neuron has inputs which correspond to the states of the other neurons. So here you have psi I, psi 1 mu up to psi n mu. And then for all these patterns, this particular neuron should have the right state in that pattern, which is given by psi I mu. And then it has its synaptic weights. And so it has to find a set of weights that's the other way around. I1, J, IN. It has to find the vector of weights that satisfies all the constraints delta if I mu positive. Okay. So that's that defines this Gardner volume. So now Elizabeth Gardner, in fact, asked the question, also added a robustness parameter to learning. So instead of imposing the constraints that delta I mu is positive for all I on mu, you can impose a stronger constraint. If you want a storage to be robust, what you'd like to have is that the delta I mu's are larger than some positive constant kappa. And that will ensure that you can retrieve the patterns now, even in the presence of noisy inputs. And essentially, kappa will be a measure of the size of the basins of attraction of each of the attractors. So that's one of the questions that was asked yesterday. So now with this approach, you can impose a minimal size of basins of attraction for each pattern using this parameter kappa. Yes?
Is there a dynamical rule associated to this? Because you're talking about dynamical features such as size of the basin of attraction, but these constraints are kinematic in a way.
Yeah, so here we're taking the same model as the Hopfield model. So we have basically this.
Okay.
Let me rewrite if you like, I can rewrite the dynamics.
Maybe useful.
So we have when we are updating a neuron, we are taking the sign of its total synaptic inputs. Jij, Sj of t. So the idea is that with these dynamics, if these constraints are satisfied, then we guarantee that these patterns are fixed points of the dynamics. Okay. And now, if we're proposing this stronger constraint, now basically the system will converge to the fixed point even if we have noisy inputs. And the parameter kappa gives you a measure of the size of this basis of attraction. Okay. And you see that, of course, if we add this stronger constraint, that will decrease the size of our Gardner subspace, because now all these hyperplanes are moved. So it's harder to satisfy the constraint. So now the Gardner volume has shrunk. Okay. So of course you see that we have a trade-off in particular between storage capacity, so the number of patterns that we can store until this subspace shrinks to 0, and the robustness of learning. Okay, so now we can ask a number of questions. So
there is a question here.
Yes.
Is the size of this Gardner space completely independent or not from the specific pattern that you have picked?
No, it depends on the specific patterns, of course. Though what will happen is that in the large n limit, basically, so what Elizabeth Gardner did and what I will describe now is that you can compute the typical volume, and basically the large n limit. What will happen is that the probability that this space is not empty will go to 1, provided the number of patterns is smaller than some critical capacity. But of course, in general, this volume depends on the particular realization of the patterns. But in the large n limit, we will have a well-defined critical capacity. Okay, so let me list a set of questions here. So one question is, what is the probability that I can find that there exists a connectivity matrix J such that a connectivity matrix J that satisfies all the constraints for a given P and N. Okay. So in the case kappa equals 0, this probability was computed, and that's a very nice result because that applies for any P and N, not only the large N and large P limit. So this was computed by Thomas Cover in 1965 using some combinatorial geometry methods, and so basically he computed this probability. And the idea of this calculation is you have to count the number of dichotomies of P points in an n-dimensional space. Okay, because essentially, so now if we look now at the space of the patterns. So now I'm looking now at the space of the neuronal states. Let's say S1, S2. So basically, all these patterns are points in this space. So this is the vector. So psi1, psi2, psi3, psi4. And then each point, so for each of these neurons, we have to each point can be either give an output which is +1 or -1. So basically, finding a weight vector that satisfies all the constraints means that you have to find a hyperplane that separates these two sets of points. And so what Cover did is that he counted the number of possible dichotomies of these of p points in this n-dimensional space that can be realized by a hyperplane. So these are called linearly separable dichotomies. Okay, and so that's kind of this is a very nice calculation that gives you, in fact, the result. So you have basically you count C of P and N, which is this number of linearly separable dichotomies of P points in n-dimensional space. And let me just plot the result. And so basically the probability then, the probability that you satisfy all the constraints is C of Pn probability that there exists a connectivity matrix satisfying all the constraints is equal to C of Pn divided by 2 to the power 2 to the power p. And so this probability p depends on we can plot p as a function of the ratio p divided by n. What we can find easily is that if p is smaller than n, then the probability is equal to 1 for any n. And then for p over n equal 2, it's actually equal to 1/2 for any p and n. And then depending on n, then this can, so for small n, this will go down like this, but as n goes to infinity, this converges to a step function. Okay. So basically in the large n limit, there is a probability 1 of finding a weight vector that will solve the learning problem. If p is larger than 2 times n, then the probability goes to 0. Okay. So that was the first step. So that's a very nice result because again, it's really a result that is valid for arbitrary p. However, this result cannot be easily generalized. So suppose now that you want to impose a robustness constraint. Suppose that you have constraints on synaptic weights, which is something I will come back in the second part of the lecture. Let's say, suppose that your weights are sign constraints as they are in real networks. So how can you compute this probability? And so that's where Elizabeth Garner enters. And so Elizabeth Garner now proposed a completely different method that now relies on the statistical physics techniques. And the idea now is to compute directly the volume of this subspace. So So the goal is to compute the volume of this subspace, or rather the fractional volume. So we can write down, so what is this volume? So we will have an integral, and we can, again, we can focus just on one particular neuron I, and so that it's the n-dimensional, we'll have an n-dimensional integral, and so P over I of, or over J of Gij. We can add some prior distribution on Jij's if you'd like. So in particular, what she used is she used a spherical constraint, so the weights were constrained to be on a hypersphere. And then we can basically impose this constraint by inserting some heaviside functions inside this integral. There should be a product here. And then we can compute the ratio between these. So that gives the fractional volume of the Gardner subspace, right? And then the idea is that is to compute this object, and of course the difficulty again is the average over the distribution of patterns. So what you have to do is to compute the average of the logarithm of the volume, and so and where these double brackets indicate averaging over the size. So I can put this explicitly so it's more clear. And again, you have to use the replica method. Okay. All right. Yes.
I didn't understand why we compute the logarithmic volume.
Okay, so this is the same reason as when you're computing so in the Hopfield model, basically the goal is to compute you want to compute the free energy of the system. The free energy is basically the logarithm of the partition function. And so this is the analog of the partition function in this problem. Okay. And basically the idea is that if you compute if you compute the average of V, that won't really give you the right answer. You have to compute the average of the logarithm of the volume, which is the logarithm of the volume is the quantity that is self-averaging. So in the large n limit, basically, that gives you the typical that will give you the typical value of the volume.
Another more technical question. There's been a product over index J in the integrals, but I don't see any product or anything over this index I. What's happening with this? It is how it goes out of equation?
Yeah, so you could do. Well, so let me step back a little bit. So essentially this constraint. So you can see that for each neuron I, there is a set of constraints that involves its own synaptic weights. Okay? Because these constraints only involve a specific rows of the connectivity matrix. So we can, for each neuron, we can compute this volume. That tells us the volume of the weights of the weight vectors of this particular neuron that satisfies all the constraints imposed by learning. Okay. And in fact, essentially and so if this fractional volume goes to 0, then of course, if you consider the whole network, then that means that the fractional volume in the whole network, which is the product basically of, you can think about it as a n, as this n times n minus 1 dimensional space is basically a product of n minus 1 dimensional spaces. Okay?
So, sorry, so this is like the volume for the ith neuron.
Exactly. This would be the I, right?
Excuse me, sorry, could you repeat what is the double bracket average?
Yeah, so that's the average over the distribution of patterns. And in fact, I realize I haven't specified. So psi mu's are IID binary random variables. So basically with the probability that psi mu equal 1 equal 1/2, and probability that psi mu equal -1 equal 1/2. So that's, and they are uncorrelated from neuron to neuron and from pattern to pattern. Okay. Now there have been alternate ways of computing this very same quantity, and in particular, Nicolas in 1989 used the cavity method and basically showed that it gives reassuringly to the same results. And finally, in 2011, a mathematician called Talagrand actually proved rigorously that the formulas that Elizabeth Gardner derived are exact. So that was the rigorous proof that the calculations by Gardner give the correct result. Okay. So this is. Okay. So here I will, now what I will do is I will take, I think, the most intuitive method, which is the cavity method, and I will sketch the main steps of the cavity method to derive basically the results by Elizabeth Gardner. But first I will just tell you what are the results. I'll just show what are the results, and then I'll go through the calculations. So the main result of Elizabeth Gardner is to compute basically the maximal capacity of the system, so alpha c, which is again this ratio between p and n. And alpha c basically is the largest value of alpha for which the Gardner volume is non-empty. Alpha c is the point at which this Gardner volume shrinks to 0. And what she did is to compute this as a function of this robustness parameter kappa. And the result is, I mean, as one would expect, is that basically alpha c is a monotonically decaying function of kappa. So the more robust you need a storage to be, then the less patterns you can store in the connectivity matrix. And reassuringly, the value at kappa equals 0 is equal to 2, which so you recover covers calculation. Okay. So here, basically, that's the basically below this curve, all the constraints can be satisfied. Above this curve, you can't satisfy all the constraints. The system you will either store a smaller subset of attractors, or so if you are considering just a single perceptron, then you will make errors. For some of the patterns, you will produce the wrong output. Right. Okay, so now let me sketch the main ideas of this cavity method. So the idea is that this will go in,
There is a question.
we will proceed, yes.
Yeah, in this, for example, at k equals 0, do you have an idea of the qualitative difference between the networks that will satisfy this Separable, like alpha 3 equal 2, and for example the network of the upfield model, or something like that, which seem to be much less
You mean,
efficient?
are you talking about similarity between the connectivity matrix?
I mean, similarity or differences?
Yeah. Okay, so first observation is that the Hopfield model has a capacity which is approximately here. So that's very suboptimal in terms of storage capacity, and I'll come back to that later. And what one can show though is that something if I have time I will come back at the end. But there is a learning algorithm that actually can produce a set of weights that satisfies all constraints, provided such a set of weights exists. And it's called the Perceptron learning algorithm. It's a very simple algorithm, but which has this very nice and simple convergence proof. And what we can show is that this, if you apply this algorithm, essentially what you'll find is that eventually the final set of weights will be actually expressed in this form, but with the important difference that here you have some weight A mu, which basically will depend on the particular realization of the pattern. Maybe some patterns are easy to learn, and so then you don't. You can even set A mu equals 0, but others you need to have a large A mu to store them. And we'll see why, in fact, in the cavity method, we'll give some. We'll get an intuitive. We'll get some intuition about where that comes from. Okay. All right. So basically, this is basically Mark Mézard's calculation, and of course, this didn't come out of the blue. So the cavity method had already been developed and had been applied successfully to the study of the Sherrington-Kirkpatrick problem. So this is just using the same method in a different problem. Okay, so the idea of the cavity method is that we'll have two steps. The first step is that we'll add a new pattern. Well, let's start maybe. So we forgot the starting point. So we assume that we've already learned. Assume that we have already learned P patterns in a network of n neurons. Okay. Now what we do is we add an additional pattern. So we add a new pattern. And I'll call it mu equals 0. This will be this additional pattern that we learn. And what we'll do is we then will compute the distribution of stabilities of this pattern once it has been learned. So we need to learn this new pattern. And what we'll see is that we can actually compute the distribution of this of the stabilities of this new pattern. Okay. However, we'll see that this the distribution of stabilities depends on the synaptic weights. Okay, and so we need to we now need to compute in fact the distribution of synaptic weights to be able to fully compute the distribution of stabilities. So to do this, we'll add a new neuron, and again I will call this new neuron I equals 0. And we and a new, so let me step back and draw again this simpler perceptron network where you have these n inputs and one output. And the idea is that we are adding a new input neuron, and so suppose this is neuron I, and now we will compute the distribution of this new weight. And this weight will be constrained by the fact that you're adding a new neuron, and now this coupling has to be done in such a way as to not perturb the learning of the previous patterns that I've already learned. And so that involves constraints on these weights, and that will give us the distribution of this synaptic weight. Okay, so let's go through the first step. So this is the distribution. This is the stability, the equation for the stability. And so let me write it again for this new pattern, delta 0 equal, and so now I will introduce, for convenience, 1 over square root of n normalization here. And we have xi I0, sum over j, jij, and this is in fact delta I0, psi j 0. Okay, so this new pattern is uncorrelated with everything that's been stored before. So clearly the distribution of delta I0 has to be Gaussian, right? We are here in the large n limit. So now what we can do is we can look at the distribution of these delta I0s over this Gardner subspace. And so now we introduce 2 different types of averages. So we have a single bracket. This is an average over j's in the Gardner volume. And again, I'll have these double brackets, which is the average over the size, the random patterns. So you have these 2 types of averages. This is in fact similar to a thermal average. This is like doing statistical physics in the space of synaptic weights, right? Instead of doing statistical physics in the space of neuronal variables. And this is the average over the disorder. Okay, so what is so let's compute the 2 first moments of this, which fully characterize the distribution. So let me call H the average of delta I0, and this average will just be basically 1 over square root of n, sum of I0, sum over j, and then the average of jij, say j0. Okay. And now let's compute the variance of delta. So we can compute, let's call this sigma delta, which would be basically delta I0 minus h squared. And then what? So basically here we'll see that we have 2 types of terms. There is a term corresponding to sum over j average of jij squared. Okay, the squares of the xi's are equal to 1, so that simplifies nicely. Then there will be terms corresponding to j different than k. And here we'll just assume that we can neglect them, okay? We just make this assumption that essentially there are the correlations between jij's and jik's will be weak enough so we can neglect them. And so that's one assumption, basically. And so basically, so that gives us the average of delta I0 square. And of course, we have to subtract the h square to this. And we can see that basically we get, by subtracting the average square, that's what we get. Okay. Okay, so that's, so we have the distribution of deltas is a Gaussian with these two moments. And now that's before we learn this pattern, right? But of course, to learn this pattern means that we need to impose this constraint that delta I0 should be larger than k. So essentially, what we will do is that we'll start from a, let's say we have a Gaussian centered on h and with some variance sigma h. And then let's say k is here. So we need to remove all that part of the Gaussian because that doesn't satisfy the constraints imposed by learning. And so basically, the distribution of deltas after learning will be a truncated Gaussian. So let's write it down. So we have a P of delta I0, and at this point, so that depends on H. And we'll see why I write down explicitly the dependence on H. So this is basically 1 over square root of 2 pi sigma delta exponential of minus half of delta minus h square divided by sigma delta square. And of course we have to, now we have a normalization factor because, so here there will be a theta of delta minus k. This is basically after we learn the pattern, we no longer have any deltas. So what this will do basically is that we'll have now a distribution that's a truncated Gaussian, and of course we have to normalize this distribution, and so that means dividing by a normalization, which would be k minus h divided by sigma delta. And here h of x is defined as the integral from x to infinity of a standard Gaussian distribution. Okay, so it's 1 minus the cumulative distribution function of a standard Gaussian. Okay, all right.
So
okay.
I just missed one detail. So in the original, for the original patterns, the stability did not have the 1 over square root of n prefactor, which
yeah, so it's just to have this basically. So if j's are of order 1, you expect that this sum will be of order square root of n. So just for the sake of simplicity, to have deltas of order 1, I'm just adding this normalization factor 1 over square root of n. You can see that the variance here will go nicely in the large n limit. Will go to some finite value. If I didn't add this normalization factor, that would diverge in the large n limit. Okay. All right. So now we've only averaged over the j's in the Gardner volume. So now let's take the second type of average of size. Where's this? And so basically we see that here we've kept the book size explicitly, so the H depends on book size. So what's the basically what are the first we see that the distribution of H will itself be a Gaussian, right? Because we have here this large number of random variables, and we see clearly that the average of H should be equal to 0, and the average of H squared will be equal to 1 over m sum over j of jij squared. Okay. And in fact, let me. Yeah, I see that I'm changing notations within the same page of my notes, so that's okay. Something like this. Okay, so now we can define. So we see that these moments. So we have the distribution of H that's Gaussian with this with mean 0 and a variance that we call sigma square H, and here there was a square that I missed. So both sigma square H and sigma square delta depends on the J's only through two quantities. So one is, I will call Q1, which is basically the 1 over n sigma over j of, and then so that's Q1. And then you have Q0, which is 1 over n sum over j jij squared. So sigma square H is nothing else but Q0. And delta, sigma delta square is nothing else but Q1 minus Q0. Okay? All right. And so we can now compute the average of, I just write it P of delta, which would be the average of P of delta H, rho of H dH, and H, rho of H is this Gaussian distribution with zero mean and variance Q0. Okay, so that's how we get the. So essentially, what the idea is that now I plotted this distribution of stabilities for a given H. So that was for a given realization of a pattern. I had a given value of H, and that's the distribution I get. But now, I have a whole distribution of H's, so H has a Gaussian distribution. And so I have to average over this distribution of H's. So this average is an average over these kind of truncated Gaussians with the distribution of H's. Yes?
Sorry, you also average the sigma delta over...
Yeah, so sigma delta is actually, does not depend on the size, as you can see. Well, they depend through Jij, so basically, yeah, I went a little bit quickly, but we can see that the average of sigma delta square will be Q1 minus Q0. Okay, so now let's see how this distribution looks like when the Gardner volume shrinks to 0. That is when we reach maximal capacity. So when the Gardner volume shrinks to 0, basically there is only a single point remaining here just before it shrinks. And so at that point, we see that Q1 and Q0 become equal, basically. Okay? This is the average of Jij squared, and this is the average Jij squared when you have basically Jij's, the space of Jij's shrink to a single point. Basically, we have that Q0 is going to Q1 in that limit. And so, and then things simplify. And the reason that things simplify is that basically the variance of this variance sigma delta square, which is proportional to Q1 minus Q0, goes to 0. And so basically we see that these Gaussians here tend to delta functions. And so let's see how this distribution look like in that limit. So Q0 going to Q1. So P of delta H will converge to a delta function, delta minus H. So it converges to a delta function, delta minus H, if H is larger than kappa. So you see that if you have initially, suppose that your H is here, then basically as Q0 goes to Q1, this converges to delta function around H. Now, however, if H is smaller than kappa, what happens is that this converges to a delta function at kappa. So everything is concentrated at kappa, which is the constraint. Okay? And so eventually, that gives us the distribution of deltas at the maximum capacity, which is composed of two terms. Let me write it. And now I just have a single Q that I will call Q. Q0 will become equal to Q1 equal Q. Exponential of minus delta square over 2Q, eta of delta minus K plus H of minus K divided by the square root of Q delta. So what you have now is you get the sum of the delta function you have a delta function at K, and the delta function at K correspond to those patterns that initially were not did not satisfy the constraint. So the H was below K, and so what happens is that after the learning process, when you're close to maximal capacity, that means that you're setting the stabilities are exactly at K. So that's the delta function here. And this is, you can think about it as the probability that the pattern, when you're generating a new pattern, it does not already satisfy the constraint. And then you have the Gaussian here, a truncated Gaussian. So now this is P of delta. The truncated Gaussian are basically the patterns that, by chance, were already satisfy the constraint when you generated them. Okay? So that's the interpretation of this distribution. Okay, but now we see that we need to compute Q0 and Q1. Okay, with basically these distributions here depend on Q0 and Q1. So that's why we need to perform the second step. Okay. So let's see what happens now when we. So now let's add a new coupling to our. So we have our neuron I, and then we have already these n couplings, and then we are adding this new one, which is here at 0. And so there is this new coupling JI0. And so this coupling will induce a change in the stabilities. Okay. So we'll have delta I mu. So for all the patterns that have already been learned, we have, so let's rewrite it, psi I mu sum over j equal of jij psi j mu. But then you have this additional term that comes from this new input, right? Of course, we have to generate also patterns, the corresponding patterns for this neuron, so which will be the psi I, psi 0 mu. We have to generate this a set of p-values. And then we have this additional term, psi psi I mu j I 0 psi 0 mu. Right. Let's call this term epsilon mu. So we see that we have basically a small perturbation. We are perturbing the deltas with this kind of small perturbation, which is over the 1 over square root of n. And of course, we have to do it in a way so as not to violate these inequalities that delta I mu is larger than k. And so that's the problem we face now. We don't want to add this coupling, and then the inequalities are no longer satisfied. So then the idea is that we need to find this weight such that all the constraints are still satisfied, and we'll compute this probability, and this will be the probability of ji0 satisfying all the constraints. And basically that means that we have to find, so we have to integrate essentially over the distribution of the stabilities. So we have delta mu and then we'll take, initially what we'll do is that we'll take the distributions of delta mu's for a particular realization of the patterns. Okay? And so what I just erased it, but what we calculated was the distribution of delta mu's for a particular realization of the patterns that lead to a mean which is h mu. And then basically satisfying all the constraints is again having this inserting this Heaviside function in this integral. Okay. All right. And here we make another assumption. There is another assumption here, is that actually this distribution of stabilities factorize. Okay. So that's another assumption that we have to make in this method. All right. So now I will just sketch the main steps, because the calculations become a bit tedious here. But here are the steps. So first we'll actually be expanding here. So epsilon mu is small. So what we'll do is that we'll make a Taylor expansion equal theta of delta mu minus k plus epsilon mu theta prime, which theta prime is of course a delta function, and then plus epsilon mu square theta second, which will be derivative of the delta function. And then we insert this in this equation, then we do a few steps of algebra, and eventually what we get is a formula like this. A ji0 minus b over 2 ji0 square. Unsurprisingly, we get things become Gaussian. And let me write down the coefficients of what are a and b. So a is equal to 1 over square root of n sum over mu of psi I mu psi I0, psi 0 mu, and this is weighted by P of K H mu, and B equal 1 over n sum over mu of P prime of K H mu plus P square of K H mu. All right, so first, that actually, comes back to one of the questions, which was comparing this approach with the Hopfield model. And you see that here you have the distribution of weights. They are actually centered around a value that's where you see this Hebbian term, this sum of psi I mu, psi 0 mu, but except that there is these weighting factors, which depend on the distribution, on the stability of this particular pattern mu, okay? And so this P of K H mu tells us how you have to weight this, in a sense, you have to weight this particular pattern in the. And another observation is that, unsurprisingly, basically what happens is the only thing that happens that matters in that distribution is actually the shape of that distribution close to the kappa, because the only constraints, the only real constraints on this weight vector are basically those patterns that were very close to kappa, that barely satisfy the inequality. So these are the patterns that actually will constrain the distribution of J's. If for patterns that have a really high stability, basically this perturbation won't do anything. But if you're exactly at kappa and you're adding this little perturbation, then maybe you go on the wrong side, and so this really matters. So that's why only the value of this distribution at k and its derivative actually enter here. All right. Okay, then what you have to do, so again, now this was actually the distribution of J's, and now you have to perform the average over the patterns. So that's a little bit tedious, but that can be done. Essentially, what you'll find is now the distribution of J's, which will be of course a Gaussian, and from this distribution you can compute now these parameters Q1 and Q0 that I unfortunately erased, but let me write that here. So knowing that Q1 was equal to 1 over n sum over j of j squared average, and then you have this additional and Q0 equal to 1 over n sum over j of and you can look at what happens in the Q0 going to Q1 limit, and eventually you find that this limit Q0, when you go to this limit Q0 going to Q1, basically alpha is given by the simple equation that was first found by Elizabeth Gardner. And so I'm going directly to the final result, but that actually takes quite a lot of lines of algebra, especially the limit is a little bit tricky, but eventually what you find is the following formula relating alpha and k and that gives you this curve that I drew in the that I erased earlier, but let me plot it again. Basically, this curve is a solution to this simple equation. You can check by yourself that when kappa equals 0, basically this is the average. This is the integral of a dt times t squared from 0 to infinity, so this gives 1/2, and minus 1 gives 2. Okay. All right. Check. Which time do I have now? Right. Okay. So let's briefly talk about a few generalizations now. And then I'll tell you more about the distribution of weights when we're adding constraints to the weight matrix. At this point, there were no constraints at all on the weight matrix. So all synergetic weights could be any value, but that will change. Okay, first generalization is what if the patterns are not unbiased anymore? So instead of having equal probability to -1 and 1, what about if you go to this sparse coding limit that I mentioned in the second course? And unsurprisingly, as in the case with these Hebbian matrices, the capacity diverges in the sparse coding limit. And so you can show that alpha c will go as 1 over 2f log of 1 over f when f goes to 0. And f is the probability, f is the coding level. So the probability that a neuron is active in a given pattern. And you might not remember the scaling for a Hebbian, for these Hebbian covariance matrices, but it turns out that this is exactly the same asymptotic form that we had for this Zodix-Feigelman, model. And so, interestingly, while for the standard coding level f equal 1/2, the Hebbian matrices are really suboptimal because you have a factor approximately 14 between the two capacities. In the sparse coding limit, these Hebbian matrices get closer and closer to becoming optimal. Okay, so we can, in fact, you can plot now the capacities as a function of f, the coding level, and we can do this from 0 to 0.5. This is alpha c, and basically in the Gardner bound. This is also sometimes called the Gardner bound because no connectivity matrix can have a capacity that's above that bound by definition, because the space of weights become the Gardner volume vanishes at that point. So this Gardner bound is has this shape, and actually if we take so this is the Gardner bound, and this is for Hebbian for a Hebbian rule, the capacity for a Hebbian rule. Okay. And so that means that, well, in the sparse coding limit, basically Hebbian rule become closer and closer to becoming optimal. And on the other hand, for the larger the coding is, then they become really suboptimal. And here, this is really a difference between an unsupervised rule. So in the Hebbian case, you're just adding the patterns. So you have no feedback, no error feedback. And basically to achieve the Gardner bound, what you have to do is to introduce supervision, which is this perceptron learning rule that I mentioned briefly earlier. And using an additional supervisory signal, then you can bridge this gap between the two. Okay, so that's the first generalization. So that was sparse coding. Second generalization, what about adding some constraints on weights? So something I told you during the first lecture, but then we forgot about it, is that real synapses are sign constrained. They are either excitatory or inhibitory, but they can't change sign during the learning process. Okay? And so what happens now if you add these sign constraints on the weights? So that was actually first derived by Amit, Campbell, and Wong in 1989. And there is a very simple result, is that if all synapses are sign constraints, the capacity is just divided by 2. Okay, a really simple result. And so now you have that the capacity, maximal capacity will be 1 if you have kappa equals 0, and then of course it decreases again with the. So that's a really simple result. And in fact, you can think about it as this. So these sign constraints introduce an additional n constraints on your problem. So you have p constraints, which come from the patterns, and you have these n sign constraints. And so the idea is that now you have that p plus n should be smaller than 2n, okay? And so that means p is smaller than n. Right, so that's kind of a very simple way of thinking about it. Okay, now we might wonder what happens to the distribution of synaptic weights now that we impose these sign constraints. Okay. And what happens is that we saw that in the absence of constraint, the distribution was a Gaussian, as one would have expected. But now, because of this constraint, and that's kind of intuitively relatively simple to understand why, we'll get a delta function at 0 plus a truncated Gaussian. So basically P of J now would be equal to, where did I put my notes? Okay. So let's write it like this. 1 minus C delta of J, and then plus some truncated Gaussian. And then theta of J. So basically, something like this. So you have basically this delta function here, and then you have this truncated Gaussian. Okay. And C here would be basically, well, you can compute it. It's basically, again, this basically from the cumulative distribution function of the Gaussian, and C would be the connection probability in this network, because you see that in this case you are setting a finite fraction of the weights to 0, and so your the resulting network after learning has taken place has now a connection probability that is less than 1. Okay, so how does this distribution now depends? And just let me step back one step. So this is really the distribution at maximal capacity. Okay, otherwise, the distribution takes a more complex form. It's not that simple. Now, question: how does this distribution depends on this robustness parameter kappa? Okay. So one might expect naively that basically we have maybe half of the weights are at 0, and then the other half which are strictly positive. It turns out that is true for k equals 0. But when k increases, then what happens is that you're setting more and more weights at 0. So the network becomes sparser and sparser as k increases, as this robustness parameter increases. So if you're plotting basically this C, which is, so C here is the connection probability. C is basically equal to 0.5 at k equals 0, but then it decreases monotonically with k. So in other words, now if you have these sign constraints, and here I just took the simplest case where all synapses are excitatory, and then of course you have to add a threshold, which but that's kind of an easy addition that you can make to this model. Then what happens is that the more robust you want storage to be, the more synaptic weights are set to 0. And there is kind of an intuitive way to think about it, is that you have, so now basically the picture I had earlier, I only had constraints due to the patterns that you learn. But now you have these additional constraints that are basically these hyperplanes at Jij equals 0, basically. And you have to be on the right side, which will be like this upper right quadrant in this case. And so now you have, suppose that you have these patterns that are imposing these constraints. And you have this Gardner volume here. Basically, increasing capacity, you're pushed away from these hyperplanes, right? The higher kappa, the more you have to be pushed away from these hyperplanes, and that means that you tend to be more and more attracted to the other hyperplanes that don't have a similar constraint. I mean, there is no such robustness associated with those sign constraints. And so that's kind of an intuition why increasing robustness means to a sparser network. All right.
Nicolas?
Yes.
About intuition, is there a geometric interpretation about the fact that alpha c goes is 1 over k squared, large k?
Good question. Not that I know. No, I don't have a good answer to that. Okay, let me see where I am now. All right, so in fact this calculation of the distribution of weights, so this kind of relatively simple generalization of previous calculation, that's a calculation that we did in a paper with Vincent Hakim, Jean-Pierre Nadal, and a neurobiologist from École d'Enval Biology Department, Boris Barbeau, and that's from a paper in 2004. And the reason we actually did this calculation was because of the following reason. So Boris Barbeau is an experimentalist that works on the cerebellum, so which is this brain structure involved with motor learning, which I mentioned briefly during the first lecture. And at some point, a few years before, he had done these heroic experiments which were measuring the synaptic weights between two different cell types in that structure. So, with a little cartoon of what are these experiments. So, in the cerebellum we have two different cell types, among others. There are many other cell types, but let's take this. Let's consider these two cell types. So one are the granule cells. Granule cells can be thought as an input layer of the cerebellar cortex. It receives information from the spinal cord, like about the state of the body. It receives information from cerebral cortex about the context of the movement that you're performing. But that's basically the idea is that it's an input layer. There is a huge number of neurons in the cerebellar cortex. In fact, more than half of neurons in your brain are granule cells. Okay, so this is which is an interesting fact. And then they send axons in the Purkinje cell layer. Let me write down the name of these cells. So these are granule cells, GC, and PC are Purkinje cells. Purkinje cells have these cells with huge dendritic trees, so they have a huge number of synapses on their dendritic trees. In fact, the anatomical estimates is n approximately 150,000. So to my knowledge, is the cell with the largest input connectivity in the brain. And there are many theories of how the cerebellar cortex work, and essentially the idea is that when we learn specific motor skills, the idea is that the weights between granule cells and Purkinje cells are adjusted so that the Purkinje cell will provide the right motor command at an appropriate time. So essentially, you can think about this network as being very similar to a perceptron that learns specific input-output associations that correspond to all the basically all these motor skills that you have to learn. Okay, so basically what Boris Barbour and his student Philippe Isop did was basically record pairs of granule cells and Purkinje cells, and they were in a configuration where they knew that. So let's look at the geometry. You have here a Purkinje cell, and basically the inputs to Purkinje cells are these axons from granule cells, and they are called parallel fibers for the reason that should be clear from this drawing. They are all parallel to each other, and the Purkinje cells have essentially planar dendritic trees, and are orthogonal to the parallel fibers. And so this is basically, and here you have a branching, and these are different granule cells here. And here you have synapses that are formed. Now, in their experiments, they were in conditions where the granule cell, they were sure that the granule cell axon would cross the dendritic tree of the Purkinje cell, and there are anatomical estimates that then you should have a synapse should be made with probability about 50%. Now, when they did electrophysiological experiments, so you can activate granule cells, and then you can record the response in Purkinje cells. And so then they found a discrepancy, because essentially they had the anatomy should tell you that the connection probability is 0.5, but if you do the electrophysiology, what you find is the connection probability is about 0.1. So there are 5 times less synaptic responses that you would expect. And in fact, they concluded, so they ruled out like many possible artifacts, they concluded that there are 80% of synapses on dendritic trees of Purkinje cells that are present but electrophysiologically silent. And the idea is that they lack synaptic receptors. And so that leads to a 0 response. And so the idea is that this is entirely consistent with the, so in fact, so that was the motivation why we did this calculation. What about if you have a perceptron that's close to maximal capacity, what does the distribution of weights look like? And we found that, in fact, it looks exactly like the distribution of weights they found, but with and the idea is that this would be consistent with a system that is really that has a strong robustness kappa. The idea is that here the observed C is about 0.2, because basically you have only, if there is a synaptic connection, there is only a 20% chance that the synapse will be non-zero. And so that's consistent with a perceptron that's maximizing storage capacity with a strong robustness. Yes?
I don't really understand the argument. I mean, if there is, to get this, you proved that for strong capacity, we will maybe have sparser
Yeah.
coping.
Yeah.
But then why in the brain, I don't understand why we have a C of 0.5, and if it's more efficient to have less, to have 0.1, why don't we have 0.1, 0.1? Why do we create synapses that are useless?
Yeah, very good question. So we don't really know, but one possible answer is that if you want to learn, suppose you want to learn new associations. Let's say you have new motor skills that you want to learn, then it might be beneficial to have, so this existing synapses can now be made, so you have these synapses that are available that you can strengthen, and that might be useful to learn new things.
So when we learn, we do not create new synapses.
Well, so yeah, that's a good question, because there is, in fact, there is also this phenomenon of structural plasticity that exists. It's not been actually demonstrated in the cerebellum, but in other structures, it's known that you can have creation of new synapses and deletion of old synapses. So in fact, this is, I think this is a great question, because why wouldn't the system just drop these synapses, and then when you need to learn something, you create a new one? One possible answer is that this takes relatively long time scales to form a new synapse. And so that maybe this is because of specific requirements of the cerebellum that you need maybe to adjust rapidly, and then having an already existing synapse with zero weight maybe leads to the possibility of faster learning. Okay, and in fact what we found also is that this distribution provides a really good fit also of the distribution of weights, of positive weights that they record it. Okay. So I think I should conclude now, but let me just mention two last pieces of information. The second piece of information is that we find that this distribution of weights also provide good fits of data in cortex. And again, in cortex, what we have, if you remember the first lectures, we have these really dense pyramidal cell networks where cells are potentially connected to any of their neighbors. That's what I told you during the first lecture. There is a potential connectivity of one, because the axon of any neuron actually touches the dendrite of any other neuron in the local neighborhood, which is maybe about 100 or 200 microns around it. But again, if you do, so that's the anatomy, so that would be cerebellum. Now in cortex, anatomically at short distances, it looks like potentially, so this would be like C pot for potential connectivity, equal 1. And again, electrophysiologically, when you make pair recordings of neurons, you find that only in 10% of cases you do find a detectable synaptic response. So again, this is consistent with the network that's been shaped by learning. And during this learning process, basically the network has decided to put 90% of synapses at 0. And consistent with the highly robust storage of information. Okay, last piece of information I'd like to tell you about is that, so in this network you have only feed-forward synapses from ground cells to Purkinje cell. Here you have a whole recurrent network. So you can look at other statistics of the connectivity matrix. For instance, if you have a pair of neurons, you have potentially they are connected potentially in two ways, but they are, in fact, you find that all possible pairs, so some are bidirectionally connected, some are unidirectionally connected, and some are not connected. Okay, and one thing you can do, well, is this consistent with the Erdős-Rényi network, like a perfectly random asymmetric network? And you find that, in fact, it's not. You have a strong overrepresentation of these bidirectionally connected pairs. So just to give you some numbers, so if you have C equal 0.1, you would expect from an Erdős-Rényi network that you will find only 1% of pairs should be bidirectionally connected, right? Just the probability should be C squared. and the data tells you that it's actually 5 times more likely. So the basic picture is that you have a network that's kind of intermediate between a symmetric network. In a symmetric network, this would be 0.1, of course. And so it's intermediate between Erdős-Rényi and perfectly symmetric. And so the last thing I want to tell you is that basically using this cavity method, we can also compute, basically using exactly the same method that I described, we can compute joint distributions of pairs of weights in the network, and we find that these distributions are basically a truncated 2D Gaussian that's a truncated correlated 2D Gaussian. And the fact that they are correlated is due to the fact that basically the Jij and JJi, they see the same patterns, right? They are driven by. So what we saw is that there was this term in the distribution that was proportional to sum over I, sum over mu of psi I mu, psi j mu, and then there was this weighting factor, P of k h I mu. So that would be for neuron I. And then in the other neuron, of course, has basically the same term, except that there is a different h. And so what that leaves is a strongly correlated, so these two weights are strongly correlated, but not identical, because basically the two neurons see different constraints, but they are strongly correlated. And in fact, what you find is that at the observed connection probability c equals 0.1, you find a very close agreement with this data. You see this overrepresentation of bidirectionally connected weights. That's basically very close to what you see in the data. So again, that's an additional piece of evidence that to have a network that's close to maximizes the robustness of stored information. So I think I should stop now. Questions? Yes?
I didn't understand how this learning process will work, because the perceptron usually you need to know all the patterns in the transmit.
Yeah, so that's where you need supervision, basically. So the perceptron learning rule is like exceedingly simple, so I can write it down quickly. So basically you present patterns sequentially, and in general you have to present them many times. And then you're just checking, so you're presenting pattern psi, and then basically you're asking the question, is the pattern already learned? If delta I mu satisfies already the constraints, then you do nothing. You don't have to modify the weights. If delta I mu is smaller than k, then you have to do something. And then what you're doing is just adding to the current weight vector, you're adding basically this product of pre and post, and that's it. So that will make it more likely that after you've done this operation, then you will now have learned this pattern correctly. So, but of course, so that compared to the Hebbian rules that I described earlier, there is this additional step of having this supervision that this error feedback.
And alpha, I think it fixed the.
Yeah, alpha here is not really a good. I already use alpha, but you can add a learning rate. In fact, it turns out that if you have unconstrained weights, then you could use any prefactor here. It doesn't really matter because, well, actually, if kappa equals 0, if you have a particular kappa here, you have to be careful with that prefactor. Yeah.
About the sign preserving rule, like the sign of cannot change sign but still each node could have positive and negative outputs, right? And real neurons would not be like that. So it is possible to just fix like this neuron is excitatory and all the inputs have to be positive or negative, and how would that change the results?
Yeah, so in fact, in this calculation that I described, so this calculation is really for all synapses are excitatory. Okay. So the sign, in fact, in all this calculation, the sign of synapses is always constrained to a particular sign. So it's not like you're not looking in this. I don't even know how you would do that, basically, if you wouldn't fix the sign of synapses. This has also been generalized later by having a combination of excitatory and inhibitory weights. And interestingly, what happens is that the inhibitory weights, the distribution of inhibitory weights is different from the distribution of excitatory weights. And in particular, what you find is that they have, there is a stronger connection probability associated with inhibitory weights. And that also actually matches the data. You have a stronger connection probability of inhibitory synapses.
Yeah.
So this was done by, so I forgot the first author, but the last author was Armen Stepanians, 2012. So it's, yeah.
Other questions?
So in the basic case, what we call learning a pattern rather than the way we behave in rule and everything, what we call learning a pattern from an input is being able to restore, whenever you have this input, to come back to those same neurons firing as those that are activated by the input, right?
Exactly.
With some, but you could also say that if some input leads deterministically to some firing pattern, even if that pattern is not the neurons being activated by the input directly, then you would still have learned to recognize the input, right? So, for instance, I guess that's what feed-forward networks do, and also that sequential, maybe, you know, have an input that starts the sequence, basically always end up in the same state. And even if that state is not the neurons of the input firing, have been learning this input somehow. So my question is, in this kind of random model, can we think about what's the distribution of inputs that could lead you to learn a pattern? And so, because it could be very different from just activating the neurons in that pattern.
I'm not entirely sure.
Sorry.
But if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that you could have a scenario in which the inputs do not really impose a particular, so you have an input that leads to a particular state of the network activity, but it's not fully imposed by the input.
Well, I mean that it's more that the pattern, the psi I mu, need not be directly the II, right?
Right, yeah.
There could be other things, right? So maybe what's the distribution of II that would lead you to learning this psi mu?
Okay, so your question is whether we could actually try to investigate what kind of distribution of inputs lead to specific patterns,
right?
Rather than.
In that sense, the question is, do those networks kind of randomly happen to work like feed-forward to some extent, where you would lead something, you would kind of encode a pattern, an input differently than the way that it is presented, or is it very unlikely if you're the reference? Sorry.
Good question. Maybe we can talk later so that because I'm still not entirely sure of what's your question. Yeah.
Other questions? No. So, well, just a few words. So Nicolas is, so this is the last lecture of Nicolas. Nicolas, I think, is leaving after lunch. So if you have other questions that you want to ask before he's leaving, well, this is the right time, so the coffee break and before lunch. So I would like to thank Nicolas for coming. I think he gave really a great series of lecture on memory, on networks of neurons. I think we had a lot of chance to have him. I also want to thank him because, I mean, as also the other professor of this school, I mean, it was really not easy to organize the school, and it's also because the professor were really available and really wanted to come. So thank you very much, Nicolas, for coming and for the great lecture.